Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're now beginning our final speaker here at the Mayflower Hotel. And after Professor Sterling finishes his talk, I will have some housekeeping remarks about the program for this afternoon and transportation to and from the George Washington University. But to introduce our final speaker of the morning, Professor Jim Muller.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my delight to introduce Chris Sterling. Chris was born in Washington, D.C., but grew up in Wisconsin, where he earned all of his degrees at the University of Wisconsin, including his first degree in political science. So I'm happy to welcome him as a fellow political scientist. If you want to know about things as varied as transatlantic ocean liners, the history of commercial aviation, military communications, including, I dare say, heliography, and other kinds of things, I can recommend his more than 24 books to you. But for many years, he's had a great interest in Winston Churchill. And as someone who enjoys all of Churchill's books and also books about Churchill, I can recommend especially Chris Sterling's book reviews in Finest Hour to you, which are wonderful for distinguishing between books that must be read and books that one ought not to read. He's, of course, been a working journalist. He was a professor and then, for a while on the dark side, even a dean at the George Washington University. And in all these years of the Churchill Center, now again the ICS's endeavors to establish a permanent home in Washington, was a great friend of this effort, which is now coming to fruition today. So I'm delighted to introduce Chris Sterling to talk on Churchill in Washington.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you, Jim. I said to David last night, what had I done wrong? How had I made him unhappy? Number one, to be the last speaker after a very intense day and a half. But worse, number two, to follow Andrew Roberts, and lunch comes right after me. I mean, good gravy. That's pretty tight. Let's see if I can do this. Hooray. Let me start with some numbers. What I'm talking about are the many trips that Churchill, later Sir Winston, came here to Washington. They span a period of 6 decades, lots of time. And he came by lots of modes of transportation. As Jim mentioned, those are 2 of my other hobbies. You're looking at the Queen Mary on the bottom in her great days. She's now a museum ship in Long Beach. And you're looking at a Boeing 314 flying boat, which was the luxury way to get across the Atlantic. Prior to the end of the war, flying boats were much more common. They have virtually disappeared because we have plenty of landing spaces for land aircraft, which are easier to maintain. Churchill, in fact, took a round trip on one of those Boeing 314s when it was incredibly rare to fly one way across the Atlantic, let alone both ways by the time he was done. So, over 6 decades, he came to the United States 16 times, not always to Washington, but he came to Washington on all but 3 of those visits. For 7 of his 13 trips here, he was serving as Britain's prime minister. Fully half of those 13 trips came after the well-known World War II travels. I'm going to soft pedal the World War II period because it's so widely covered, people know it very well. I want to talk a little bit about some of the other trips. His very first one was in 1900. He came as a young man And yet, even so, thanks to the fact that he had good social connections, he met President McKinley. Churchill was at this point, 25, 26, and he gets to meet the president. So it starts something that builds over time. But time is crucial. The next 3 decades, he does not come to Washington. His next trip is in 1929, and that's the longest gap in this whole series. He comes in 29. He had just left the chancellorship and beginning his wilderness years. He was traveling as a private citizen. He and Randolph, and I believe his brother Jack, were on this wonderful long trip around the country. He spent time in one of my favorite places, the Canadian Rockies, and then down the West Coast and Hollywood, and meeting all the Hollywood people, staying with William Randolph Hearst in that incredible place, now a state park in California. So he was here very, very briefly. In 1942, jumping ahead, and I'll come back, he took that round trip on the Boeing 314. Only in 1943 did he come twice in the same year. I am convinced that this had to do with me. I was hatched in this town, as Jim said, in April of 43. Sir Winston came to check me in May and came back in August to make sure I was still here and all was well. Sadly, I don't remember these. I wish I did. I was living up in Cleveland Park, just a few miles from the White House. I want to talk next about some of the, we've used that slide, there we go, about visits to Congress and visits to Parliament, specifically the Canadian Parliament. On 3 of his trips, he addressed a joint session of Congress. When addressing one is unusual. We've already heard about that first one where he made the very famous statement that if his father had been American and his mother British, as he said, I feel I might have got here on my own. And the congressman enjoyed that and remembered it. During his longest trip to Washington, he made a side trip up to Ottawa, and as has already been mentioned, he had this famous photograph taken. Most of you have probably heard the story. This is not about Washington, it's about Ottawa. He had just addressed the Canadian Parliament. He comes into the anteroom, is briefly introduced to a very young photographer. And you've heard the story. I assume it's true, but somebody here may set it straight. That Joseph Karsh, looking at Churchill, it wasn't quite the right image. He reached forward and took the cigar out of either Churchill's mouth or Churchill's hand, and then immediately flashed the picture. So what you're looking at is Churchill wondering, who is this young whelp, and why did he just do what he did? As we also know, there is a second, and I think at least a third photograph. The second one is the cover of the program for this conference, which the family did like better. He is smiling. He's not looking quite as angry. This, of course, is the iconic picture that virtually everybody remembers and has seen before. Congress, by the way, did not forget him after all those visits. When he died in 1965, congressmen all stood up, most of them, and said something about Sir Winston, most of the remarks eminently forgettable, which is probably why they were published in one of these hardcover black volumes that Congress will issue for important people, almost always members, when they die. Now, what about the presidents? 10 of the trips, as he put it, were to parlay, his word, to parlay with American presidents. The 4 to see FDR are easily the best known. And they were the longest visits, and we can argue they were the most important because they helped to define the direction of the war, at least for the Anglo-American side. But I want to look, as I said, I want to look at the post-war trips. He came to visit then relatively new President Truman in 1946 on a trip that included the famous and controversial Iron Curtain speech that we've heard mentioned several times, the wonderful long train trip out to Jefferson, Missouri, playing cards, drinking, talking, maybe getting some sleep, I'm not sure, and then by car to Fulton. I want to recommend, because I'm betting most of you have never been in Fulton, it's a little out of the way. I strongly recommend you go. It is a wonderful visit, very peaceful, small town, small campus, with that Christopher Wren Church, totally reconstructed, having been destroyed during the war. And that's why you need to do two things if you go to Fulton. And again, this is not Washington, but for a moment I have the podium. Upstairs, the Christopher Wren Church redone. I was there luckily once when the organ was playing, and you could really imagine it back in its original London location. And then downstairs, the very spectacular Churchill Museum, dramatically redone 5 or 6 years ago now. Well worth seeing. All right, so he comes 4 times to see Truman, 3 times to see Eisenhower. I've mentioned the first trip to see Truman. In 1949, he and Truman have a brief meeting in Blair House, not because he's unimportant, but although he is out of power, as he was in 46, but because the White House was being rebuilt. And the Trumans lived in Blair House most of that period of time. In 1952, January of 52, Churchill, now back, of course, back in power, focused on his attempts that were very, very strong, as we've heard several people say in his second period as premier, focused on, number one, the attempt to rebuild, strengthen the wartime special relationship, which of course had been FDR and Churchill, not Truman, who was so out of the loop he didn't even know about the atomic bomb until after FDR died and he was briefed. Finally, in 1953, Churchill hosted a dinner, I believe, at the British Embassy for the then outgoing Harry Truman and his top aides. That overlaps with the 3 trips to see Eisenhower. The first, also 1953, same trip. He sees Ike up in New York, begins to rekindle the wartime links, which may have been stronger in Churchill's mind than they were in Ike's. A little hard to tell, but if you follow events over the coming years, that seems to be a point. In 1954, on the second visit, and shortly before he left Downing Street, Churchill tries to get Ike to agree to developing a summit meeting with the Soviets. Stalin has died. There's a new team headed by Georgy Malenkov in the Kremlin. Eisenhower wasn't having any of it. Part of that, I think, was John Foster Dulles, the wonderful quote by Sir Winston on Dulles as dull, duller, Dulles. He was totally unimpressed with John Foster Dulles, who took a rather black and white view of the world. Ike wasn't having the notion of a summit meeting. The American government was not at all convinced this was the time. The feeling was this might be perceived as a sign of weakness, and so it wasn't time. This was perhaps the biggest sad moment, and that's understating it, in Churchill's professional life after the war, that he could not get that summit meeting, and then that the summit meeting actually takes place after he has left Downing Street. His last visit to see Ike is in 1959, and Churchill is, of course, retired. He visits with Ike here and also in Ike's farm up in Gettysburg, and they overlook some of the famous battle scenes in the American Civil War. That was also an interesting trip. It was his 13th and last to Washington, barring one thing, which I'll get to. And it was his first round trip by jet airliner. In 1959, that was still relatively rare. Jets had gone into service only the year before. The Comet was Britain's attempt to win a piece of the market in airlines, and there I go on a different hobby of mine, sorry. In 1963, that's one slide too soon, I hit a button. But I'll leave it there, because it's a positive thought. In 1963, in a sense, he has one more trip. He cannot come himself. He is too weak and ill. But Randolph and grandson Winston come to Washington to accept from President Kennedy in the Rose Garden Churchill's honorary American citizenship and even a passport. That's a very quick summation, very quick. We've got, I think, time for some Q&A. I realize we're holding you up from lunch. We've taken away the slides so you don't get too carried away. Where's our mic? Okay. All right. Sir, mic's behind you. There you go.
Very simple question. You had 11 visits, 10 visits to the presidents, but 4 and 4, the sum adds up to 11. Was the difference the visit with Truman after he had left the White House?
It was just as he was leaving. What the real problem here may be is I share something with Sir Winston. Math has never been a strong point of mine. So I may possibly have miscounted even with very, very small numbers. Other questions? There's one. All right, go ahead. Go ahead. Whichever way, John. Sir.
This December will be the 75th anniversary of Churchill's visit to the White House in 1941. And of course, we all know the story of Winston Churchill before President Roosevelt saying something to the effect, "You see, Mr. President, I have nothing to hide." Mm-hmm. Could you comment on the significance of that meeting and possibly the circumstances of how it came about? We're led to believe that Sir Winston Churchill invited himself, and the rest, of course, being history.
I think the invited himself is somewhat true. He came over roughly 2 weeks, maybe it was 3, after Pearl Harbor. The White House and the American government, the American military had their hands full with lots of things to do. They weren't sure they wanted Churchill on their laps. He came over. I think it's a very important meeting. It was the first serious wartime, meaning both countries were by then at war. Therefore, I'm not talking about Newfoundland here. Both countries were at war. It was the first, I would argue, serious face-to-face attempt to develop war policy, and particularly the Europe first, the Germany first. There was great push, especially in the American Navy and Admiral King, to go at the war in the Pacific and the Japanese as the real push, that Europe wasn't that crucial. I think that meeting in part kept the Germany first very much alive. There's a question here, so one more. Sir.
I have to say something about Go Blue, and that is that Churchill visited Ann Arbor in 1901 as part of that trip, and Detroit, 1932. So we had the opportunity of seeing him. I have what is an obvious question. You speak of his discussion in Congress that had his father been American and his mother British, he might have gotten there on his own. But by American law, wasn't he also an American citizen because one of his parents was American?
I defer to legal minds to answer that. My understanding is, and the rules have changed. The rules have changed. You can now have, for example, dual citizenship, which was not possible that far back. My understanding was no. Yes, his parentage was equally divided, but that no, he didn't. He did not officially hold that role. Jenny did become an English citizen. Randolph, I'm looking for confirmation. Or Jenny, I'm looking for confirmation. Did the other Jenny take British citizenship when she married Randolph?
I don't think you have to worry about solicitor's tax returns.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Sterling and Professor Muller. We've now got a number of housekeeping remarks to make. The very first thing I want to tell you is going to be disappointing, and that is the lunch that we have prepared for you in the hallway will look absolutely nothing like the luscious repast that Christopher had
I thought about that.
displayed. Christopher promised he was going to do something to embarrass me, and he's succeeded. All right. First thing I want to do is, since this winds up the formal panel presentations here at the Mayflower, is thank once again all of our speakers, moderators, those who did introductions, everyone who spoke from the microphone. A brilliant job, and thank you once again. I want to thank my conference committee once again, whom I thanked yesterday individually. Last year's conference in Britain was so enormously successful. Blenheim Palace, the Duke of Marlborough, Ditchley Park, and we came away thinking from that, well, our colleagues in Britain have set the bar so high for conferences that I don't know how we're even going to reach that level, let alone top it. And then after thinking about it, I realized, well, we don't actually have to keep topping ourselves each year. If we can just maintain the same standard that was established for us last year in Britain, we should have a gold standard conference every year. And I'm happy to announce now that next year's conference will be in a city we have never visited before for a conference, oddly enough, but it's called New York City. All right, the housekeeping details. Lunch is a buffet that is literally in the hallway right outside this room. Now, transit to and from the Mayflower to Gelman Library, which is where our National Churchill Library and Center is housed. The buses will depart from DeSalis Street, same buses we took last night, to the State Department. They will begin loading at 2:30, and the first bus will depart at 5. The return, you will load the buses the same place where you unload the buses, and they will begin loading at 4:45. The open house at the National Churchill Library and Center includes food, well, hors d'oeuvres. So if you don't want to take of the lunch here, there is something, a bite, nibble on when you're over there. And during the open house is from 3 to 5, but during the middle of that time, at 3:15, we will have our last speaker of the conference, Michael Makovsky. He's going to be speaking on the top floor of the Gelman Library about Churchill and Chaim Weizmann. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We could not have done this without.
Before you all go, if you'd give me 1 minute, I want to thank David for doing an astonishing job putting this program together. I think he's marvelous. But before I do that, I have to disagree with David. It is unacceptable not to beat the previous year. We are not interested as Churchillians in mediocrity. Excellent is what you expect, and I know it's what we'll get from you next year.
So
thank David.